Welcome to All Right in Sin City, a podcast about writers and writing in the Windsor, Detroit region. Your podcasters today are
Irene Moore Davis, author, educator, and local historian.
Sarah Jarvis, former bookseller, publishing rep, and literary festival chair.
and me, Kim Conklin, Windsor-based writer and filmmaker.
This recording takes place online in the era of safe physical distancing. Our guest is D.A. Lockhart. He is the author of 7 books, including Devil in the Woods, The Gravel Lot That Was Montana, This City at the Crossroads, Big Medicine Comes to Erie, and an essay collection called Wënchikàneit Visions. D.A. Lockhart holds degrees from Trent University, Montana State University, and Indiana University. His work has appeared in Best Canadian Poetry in English 2019, TriQuarterly, Arc Poetry Magazine, Grain, Belt, and the Malahat Review, among others. He is also the publisher at Urban Farmhouse Press and poetry editor for the Windsor Review. He is a Turtle Clan member of the Lenape people, a registered member of the Moravian of the Thames First Nation, and currently resides at Waawiiyaatanong on the south shore of the Detroit River, also known as Windsor, Ontario, and Detroit, Michigan. This year, he has published 2 new books, Breaking Right with Porcupine's Quill, and Tùkhòne, Where the River Narrows and the Shores Bend with Black Moss Press. Welcome, D.A. Lockhart.
How's it going, Ani? How's it going? Good to stop by and chat again.
Nice to see you. You've always been a remarkably prolific writer and publisher, but we're living through an unusual era. First of all, how are you and your family doing during the pandemic? And secondly, has the pandemic had any impact on your writing routine?
Well, first of all, we're doing as well as anybody else could be doing. You know, we're sheltered. Sheltered. We're still in our house. We still walk our dogs, and sometimes we're known to drive to the grocery store. But we're doing well enough, all considering, and very grateful. I'm a very privileged person that I own my own home, so that makes things a little bit easier now. And my definitely, I think often of folks I know that are having difficulty right now. So that aside, writing, that's what I do for a living, right? Kind of. It has been challenged this year. I will say Tùkhòne actually came out of the first month or so of the lockdown back in March. At least the second half of the book did. So it was sort of fruitful in that sense, but things sort of slowed down for a while. I think just trying to figure things out where we're supposed to be going. I am working on 2 government grants, so I still was having to write. And that was sort of pulling teeth sometimes, but we're still getting along. That's what we all do, man. It's Margaret Atwood told us that Canadian Lit's all about survival, not about winning. And right now we're doing the survival part pretty well. So,
Since we last interviewed you about a year ago, you've published 2 new books. Tùkhòne is a poetry collection, and Breaking Right is a collection of short stories. How does your writing routine differ when you're focusing on poetry versus fiction, or are you able to work on both forms simultaneously?
It's been a weird year. I will say being prolific is also because I got a lot of sort of lead time with writing older stuff. So Breaking Right, unlike Tùkhòne, it's been around for a long time. The first story sort of came out of workshops at IU. And you can see how this is all affecting us all mentally, because I'm about to ask you to repeat the question because I seem to have lost the second half of it.
Well, I was just asking, you've published 2 books this year. And so does your writing routine differ for one form of writing versus another? And I know you also, just to complicate the question, you're doing a lot of admin as well with various places that you work for. How do you divide all that up?
Well, really, it's just about, you know yourself. So this is about understanding your natural clock. So when you get up in the morning, when I get up in the morning, I understand I'm going to do certain things better at certain times of the day. This is a general answer to the difference between writing, editing, and admin work, right? So first thing in the morning, there ain't no creativity. It's me cranky with a cup of coffee and, I don't know, if I'm lucky, a piece of fruitcake. And just going through the basics, like, the emails, like, oh, apologies for getting back to you so late, that kind of stuff, But that's where my morning starts. That's the admin work. The editorial work comes in the afternoon mainly, and that is the sort of space that I use to review work that either I'm editing for myself or someone else. It's when my sort of mind's woken up enough. And then by evening time, after we're done listening to some late night sort of CBC music, I love After Dark on CBC Music, I end up settling into more creative aspects of writing. And as for poetry and fiction, they can't really coexist on my brain very well. Maybe it's a little PTSD left over from doing my degree in fiction. So it takes a lot more effort for me to, rightfully so, to do short fiction or even long fiction. So those tend to come at different times. However, I do find that poetry and essays do tend to work well together. So, for whatever reason.
Tùkhòne refers to the Detroit River borderlands of Windsor, Ontario, and Detroit, Michigan. In the book, you discuss both cities and the natural settings around them. In the introduction, you also refer to a more environmentally aware moment and motion in North American poetry. Could you talk a little bit more about that idea?
Well, I will say that when I first started paying attention to lit, it was more about wordplay than it was necessarily. And that was maybe just where I was as an individual reading what I was reading, right? So when I first started off, that's what I was primarily seeing. And myself, this was in the late 90s into the early 2000s. So then by the time I got out to Montana, I got to know Greg Keeler, who was friends with Richard Brodigan. So a little more sort of, they are still absurdist in the way that I tend to like to write or read anyways. So they started sort of showing me that path forward. If we look at the sort of history of poetry that comes out of the region here, even the Midwest, it's there is some environmental poetry and work, but that's really only sort of arisen in the last probably 15 years or so. When I had first arrived in Indiana, that was the thing in Indiana, right? We had Scott Russell Sanders, who was writing essays about it, but then we also had Morris Manning, whose work on I'm trying to remember their ecologues that he wrote that were just fantastic. Now he's down in Kentucky. Ross Gay tends to be a little more lyric, but his works, even in like personal gardens and stuff, these were all professors I worked with at IU. So they really sort of guided me on that path. By the time we got up to Windsor, Detroit, I mean, our best sort of environmental writers that I knew of was Philip Levine, and he wasn't even that environmental. It was more of a personal relationship with manufacturing. And there is this sort of underlying story of the land that's here that is almost ignored because of borders and union work and all the other stuff. Like there's a history that dates before all this. So how can we connect that and root that? Because right now we're upset a lot because we don't have jobs, because we keep losing the thing that we measure ourselves by here. So we have to try to reimagine that.
Do you think maybe there's a little bit of, or has been a little bit of reticence by writers to tackle environmental topics? Do you think that's something that they shy away from?
Well, I think, because oftentimes what we will see, I mean, just most poets will tend to move within culture, within society. I know if I were to walk over onto Paulette right now, I'd probably have to dodge about 7 trucks, like pickup trucks, for people that don't do construction work. They're probably retail workers or something stupid like that, right? I mean, not that retail work is stupid, but I mean, you don't need a pickup truck to go to your retail job, right? I love my retail workers, but so there's always been this sort of dislike of environmentalism in Windsor. I grew up here. I left large part because of it. I mean, I went to Trent. I don't know if it gets much more environmental in Southern Ontario. Well, I guess it's Central Ontario there, but there's a reticence there because I think even academics like to see the wordplay more than they like to talk about the environmental issues, because this is something it's a life-threatening, it's a civilization-threatening thing that we need to talk about. It's the elephant in the room. And it doesn't matter if you're a politician, an academic, or even a publisher. It's hard when you're at the top and you know you have to change the world. So I don't know. There is a pushback. I know it limits me where my work will appear, for sure, 100%. But it's also what I have to do.
In this collection, Japanese poetic forms, haiku and haibun, are featured pretty heavily. What was it that drew you to those particular forms as you were working on this?
Well, I've always loved haiku and haibun and sort of more of the traditional Japanese forms. Right now, I'm even reading Sanshiro by Soseki, Meiji Japanese novel. I'm fascinated with Japanese culture because there's so many connection points between indigenous thought and traditional sort of Japanese Zen Buddhism and Shintoism. So much so that let me also take the side note that when I first started writing poetry, Gary Snyder was one of my early guides. So Snyder has a very strong connection to haiku and Zen and Japanese forms. Then I discovered Gerald Visner's early haiku forms, and he was working very much so. For those who don't know, Gerald Visner is the great Anishinaabe poet, theorist, scholar. He used these forms in a way that was very traditional to the Japanese, but also very in keeping with traditional teachings from his nation. So I saw a lot of great potential there. Obviously, with the whole construction of Zen poetry and sort of haiku and even haiban, it really lends itself towards talking about the concrete world, but also making reflections upon something beyond that. So it was a well-suited form, and I wanted to delve more into it. Like, my early work did tend to focus a lot on haiku. I have I think 6 or 7 haiku in the gravel lot that was Montana. So it was an expansion of that form. What can I really carry on with this sort of form that I love about a place that I love? So it was just a very opportunistic moment.
In Tùkhòne, in a section called City Songs, paid homage to a number of musicians from this region. So can you tell us about the process of selecting the artists and songs that you wanted to highlight?
This goes back to the sort of when the pandemic starts. So when the pandemic starts, it's March 7th, sort of the night before it all starts. I'm in Detroit to watch Sloan. So there becomes this sort of the last moments I'm in Detroit seeing America is to see music. And even when I had left Detroit, it was all about music. Like, we always were brought back to it because Detroit has this sort of great sonic history, this great musical history. And I was thinking about this already because I was doing a lot of book touring sort of in the fall of 2019, and I had started in the spring. So spending a lot of time on via trains and planes and mass transit listening to music, which actually happened to be a lot of Detroit music. So while I was editing some of the stuff for this book, WDET started doing this is because we're all locked down, so let's all talk about Detroit music. They started playing some Detroit music, and I'm like, well, I'm going to do my own research. So sometimes what they were doing in the afternoon on as Detroit Today, I would then sort of follow leads from that. And what ended up happening was I ended up relying a lot upon my time living in Detroit. So a lot of the music that's in here, the stuff I was listening to when I was living in Metro Detroit. And it became the way in which it reflects the land itself. So there was lots of songs that got cut, lots of individual haiban that got cut because I just didn't have the time to edit them, add them in the way I would have liked to. But most of the ones that made it, I'm very happy to make it. They're all stuff I listen to. I have vinyl of a lot of them. I know, I'm a hipster. I have a problem.
Vinyl is cool, yeah. So there's a lot of emphasis on Indigenous language in this poetry collection too, celebrating it, reclaiming it, mourning the loss of it. In your writing, do you have particular goals for the preservation of language? Is that something you consciously set out to do?
Yeah, so language is, I think, especially when we talk about, for Tùkhòne, there's the idea of the city song in it, right? That the language itself actually becomes a song, a reflection of the place, a reflection of the culture and the time. And a lot of my relatives up Bucktown Way, they're all singers, but they all sing in English. Recently, within the last 20 to 15 years, we all started learning bits and pieces of the language. They know much more than I do. And now they can sing in our language, and it just means all the difference. So my daughter can now understand some Lenape, or some Unami specifically, and some Nish. So this is really important for me moving forward because that's the sound of our ancestors. That's the sound of our culture. It's the sound of our land. I mean, think about even when I speak about a cormorant. Cormorant in English does not sound great, and I use cormorant because there it is right in the front. I love cormorants, but the term in Anishinaabe Moen is gagashivig. It has this sound, this song to it. It's beautiful, and that's just something that I want preserved. We had almost lost our language. Very thankful for the work done by the Oklahoma bands to save it, and to Muncie, Delaware for saving the Muncie language up here, that we need it written down and put in places. So as I was publishing, I was noticing all my books are picked up in New York City. So if you go to the New York Public Library, all of books for me are in their system because I'm Lenape. So how can I possibly leave some kind of record for the next generation? And that is these small glossaries. I mean, yeah, there's the Lenape dictionary online, but how can we use that, move it into our language, right? So this is also the hope is, I love language. I'm obsessed with dictionaries, development of languages, that how can we as a cultures, individual cultures, re-embrace our languages? I saw it when I went up to James Bay Cree territory back in the late 90s, that there's a pidgin language that develops. And the hope is that maybe that happens. And not just amongst indigenous people using the language, but non-indigenous alike. So Studis, right? Skoden, those are examples of sort of cross-cultural pollination that I'd like to see happen. Will it? I don't know. But.
Well, how would you describe the sound of your language as compared to maybe the sound of English? What's the difference in terms of musicality?
So I would say I keep in mind, I know Anishinaabe-Moan a lot better than I know my own language, Unami. They are somewhat related, so some words are similar. This is different sounds. I almost describe it, if you listen to one of our traditional storytellers, it comes like a sing-song. It almost sounds to me like wind, like a sabequat, which is another word that's Anishinaabe-Moan word, of wind through the trees. It's like a wave, and it represents sort of a ongoing movement of almost water or lifeblood through generations. English to me is a little more stilted. Even when I listen to Norwegian, because I know a little bit of Norwegian, it does sound a little more sing-songy. And I don't know what it is. Maybe it's our mechanical lines that have changed us, or the ability of English to absorb other languages. I mean, maybe that's part of it too. But there is a different song to it. There's almost a heartbeat that I could find it. I don't know, maybe it sounds poetic, but that's the way it is.
So your other book, published in 2020, Breaking Right, is a short story collection rooted in a different place, Indiana, but an otherworldly mythological version of Indiana. It's quite different from other writing that we've seen from you, at least lately. What did you enjoy most about working on that collection?
You know, it's a really completely different space to write from. Because with being a poet, oftentimes you are a poet when you're writing that, or there's an extension of yourself as another speaker. So you're still always a poet. You're always fundamentally someone who's aware that you're playing with the language and the sound, maybe trying to do something bigger. But when it comes to fiction, so in this particular case, Breaking Right, it's told from the viewpoint of what I would call as a sort of rooted in the land Hoosier storyteller. I had a lot of great friends that taught us to do this. So when we lived in Indianapolis, we had a big size property and a big fire pit in the backyard. And all summer long was bonfires, and people would come over, and it would literally just be people sharing stories about their lives in Indiana. We knew a lot of Hoosiers back then. So the story about the UFO, that was from a campfire story. There's the story about the Mothman, that comes from an academic text. We don't need to worry about that. The coal barge burning, flooding, all this stuff. A lot of this stuff comes from Hoosier storytellers that sort of guided me towards telling the stories. But then I took the skill set that I learned at IU, which involves sort of manipulating a little bit, right? Placing the proper order, and having a good editor helps, but we'll talk about that later. But it was, it's a much different, because it wasn't indigenous necessarily. There was some indigenous references in it, but it's stories from the land. These are people that don't think about Indians on an everyday basis. This is Indiana is a place that's hard scrabble that you got to try to get by. Rural. There's lots of stuff, even talks about universities in there. So like it's more rooted to Hoosier experience.
That's an interesting point that you raised, is you're talking about you're an editor, a prolific editor yourself, and we're going to talk a little bit about one of your roles, but you also are edited by others. How does that process work for you? Do you have to like switch gears in your brain, or is it just an interesting process?
Well, you know, I was fortunate in the sense that I had to live through 3 years of workshop at IU, so I learned how to take a beating. And that's a very good thing, especially with Breaking Right. I feel like that collection, Stephanie Small at Porcupine's Quill did an amazing job editing that. If I look good, it's because of her. And what it really comes down to is following some of our traditional teachings. We have to listen. We have to respect what other people have to say. And the way in which I envision my work is one thing, but I always understand that the way in which it's going to be read, I come from a different culture. I come from a different experience. The book, for example, Breaking Right, is really an American book being read and published now in Canada. There is some cultural barriers I'm jumping there. So I need someone who has experience in that. So when they approach the language, they approach the story, they internalize the story, they want it to be told so that it's understood. And that's what a good editor does. They listen, just like you should when they approach you. And they always do. I've not really had a disrespectful relationship with editors. Obviously, I have lots of publications all over the place, right? I encourage them to I always say, tear my shit apart, is what I say. And when it comes back red and dripping in mess, I know that they've done their job. And now it's time for me to do mine. Not saying that every edit they ever always say is right, but I'm saying it's, you need to listen. Otherwise, you fail.
So you've recently yourself become the poetry editor for the Windsor Review. What appeals to you most about that opportunity?
It's for the Windsor Review, it's legacy in a big way. And I know I say that word a lot, but there's this idea that the Windsor Review is this continuum of a publication in this community that's so central, on both to Windsor and Detroit, but to Waawiiyaatanong or Tùkhòne, whatever way you want to say it. This is something that while I lived here, I didn't really know about it necessarily. I moved away to find out about it, which is the way Windsor seems to work, right? But with the Windsor Review, it was the way in which I could say, look, I came back here. Marty Gervais definitely took me under his wing, helped me sort of get published, learn the system. I started learning with a lot of the other local writers, got to meet Dale Jacobs, a lot of the sort of folks that had constructed Eugene McNamara, how could I possibly not say his name, Susan Holbrook, all these sort of fantastic writers that have made Windsor a literary destination for well before I ever knew it was anything, right? So they're all connected to that. And they had guided it in their own way, right? To guide their generation's principles of reading and writing. The Windsor Review published a lot of my work before I took on the poetry job. And I was really excited to take it on because of Dale. I think Dale Jacobs being the head of it, and Dale as a person is really interested in sort of pop culture. And he's really guiding the Windsor Review maybe back towards something it used to be, which not saying that what it was before wasn't good, but that sort of change, that natural migration is really a fascinating thing. And, I like the idea that it's being approached as an approachable literary journal, something that's open to the whole world rather than something that's cloistered in academia. This is a change culturally. And I want to be part of that because you all should know I got a big mouth online. I'm definitely capable of going after anyone who I construe as problematic to society. And I think this is a way of sort of giving back to that, to expand these notions of multiculturalism, I don't like multiculturalism. Is that still a thing? Do we still talk about that? But multiple voices, a plurality of voices, a plurality of experiences. And I think that's at the heart of what the Windsor Review is trying to do. We're trying to, it's building the bridges between Windsor and the world. And I think that's what's really cool. And it was a really exciting project. Obviously, having Marty say, I'd love it if you could do this too. That's another good thing. So I don't know, all in all, is one of the things I'm probably most proud of, to say I've come from a grad student submitting to the Windsor Review to an emerging poet who had his work appear there, and now as the poetry editor for one of the more storied literary mags in Ontario. That's something to do, man. That's pretty cool.
It is a great thing for Windsor and for the world, yes. So you're always writing something. What's your next project?
Well, we do have another book coming out next year, which is The Bear Men Descend Upon Gimli, which is kind of, I'll talk about it in a sec, but it's with Frontenac House, which is really exciting because I get to work with Micheline Mailer as my next editor. And she's gonna, I feel bad for her because it's a novel and poems. So remember all the PTSD I talked about? I just wrapped that into a bunch of poems. But that's what's coming out with Frontenac House. And it'll be great to have something out on the West Coast, or West Center. So That's basically it follows a mythological curling match in Gimli, Manitoba, between all the nations of Canada, and it's to fight over a stolen Bonspiel trophy. So it's should be fun. Lots of music again. I don't know why I always go back to more music in there. Maybe watch too much Guardians of the Galaxy. I don't know what it is. There's no dancing trees. Don't worry.
So we'd love it if you would read something for us.
The haiku always seem weird to read, don't they? I mean, when you hear someone read haiku, does that seem strange? No?
I don't think so.
It doesn't matter. Okay, I like this. Okay, so we all miss Detroit. And one of the things that when I moved back, I really loved about Detroit, I love sports. And not a big surprise. But I also, oddly enough, love soccer. And the coolest thing about Detroit was going to Detroit City soccer games for a while. Those that don't know, Detroit City is the professional soccer team. It's now based in Hamtramck. But they were owned by and they still are, by the fans. So that it makes a way different experience. It's regularly referred to as sort of the greatest experience in sports. And it's like a riot all the time, which is maybe says something about Detroit. But there's this guy who plays for Detroit City. His name is Seb Harris, and he's a defender. And we would always sit in the stands and watch him because he looks like he's always annoyed trying to do anything in sport. Instant love affair between me and him. He's like, I think of there's the Camp movie with Paul Rudd. I think of that character. You're gonna just look at me odd and say, okay, Dan, whatever. So let's read. Seb Harris makes the start for Detroit City after the MC5's Motor City is burning. Every riot is a controlled act, an outpouring of raw sentiment. Because of this, the Motor City is burning, baby, and ain't nothing you can do. And I march in this football club supporter pageant to the quilt work neighborhood on the south side of Hamtramck, and it is hot, like the sun might be setting, but it is jealous enough of the night to leave enough heat to make sure we don't forget how it dominates everything. And there are drums, and there are flags, and there are fire bombs bursting all around me, baby. Feel the air. Feel the air, feel this air, and it's 90 straight minutes of motions in unison, chanting the ancestors back upon the field, casting the only medicine upon visitors that we have left. Black-gloved hands thrust into bruised night sky. Smoke billows red from flare top. Miss those Detroit City games. Nothing better than some toxic masculinity to make you all feel better. You know, there was this, so I did this really cool thing this year, and it was, I always talk about Aretha because she's the queen of the whole area. She still is, because we all know when she died, we had the rainbow over Comerica Park. So I did a reading for Whistler Writers Festival, and it was a cabaret where we got to perform with the whole band. And I of course had to make them do something that was difficult. So I'm like, I want to do the Aretha song. So they actually performed Aretha's Say a Little Prayer for Me, trumpets, everything, while I read this poem. So when I read it now, I still hear it. So I'm going to read it because I want to hear that song right now. Okay. So, and you know, it's the weekend, so we should be thinking about church, right? Tomorrow's churching day. So in this city of prayer, after Aretha Franklin's I Say a Little Prayer, whisper our direction as rising sun coaxes hazed mist from trees above rectangular residential blocks. Bounded in the mists of righteous colonial rule and the belief that deities fit into one imported religion, we move on. Upon crooked currents of vehicular glide, we course past shuttered auto plants, cinder block payday loan cages, and hand-painted Michigan Lotto party stores. First hours of morning in an impossible city. Windows down and into the day, we roll with FM radio gospels, last night's brown bag empties in vacant fields, parking lots. The moment I wake up, before I put on my makeup, I say a little prayer for you. Eastward to the market, through wide boulevards and crooked, rusted lampposts, St. Josaphat rises before the overpass across the freeway below. We cross below the church, the quiet of shuffle between songs and the rush of air as we make our way. This is my prayer. Answer my prayer. 3 church turrets, claw at sky, Rensen, shadow behind it. I want to go listen to that now. I swear.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So we've been hearing from D.A. Lockhart, whose new books are Breaking Right and Tùkhòne, Where the River Narrows and Shores Bend. D.A. Lockhart, thank you so much for joining us.
Nishik for having me. And stay safe and healthy, y'all. Much love. Totally.
Thanks for joining us. Look for more episodes of All Right in Sin City wherever you listen to podcasts, or check out our website, allrightinsincity.com. For information and announcements of new podcasts, sign up to our email list or follow us on Facebook and Twitter.